Hello, and welcome to episode 184 of Dark and Stormy Book Club. We're back from vacation and rested up and ready to bring you some new and interesting authors and books to read. The first is Stephanie Kane. Enjoy.
I'm Ann Dart.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome.
If you enjoy our show, please consider contributing to the Dark and Stormy Patreon. By becoming a patron, you will help us create better and quality content. There are also benefits to becoming a patron, such as exclusive content and Dark and Stormy merchandise. Become a supporter at patreon.com/darkandstormybc. Check our website for the link. We appreciate any and all contributions. Thank you.
Cold Case Story by Stephanie Kane is based on the brutal murder of a housewife in the Denver suburbs in 1973. A college student back then, Stephanie was more than a witness to this terrible crime. For nearly 30 years, she remained silent. Then, in 2001, she tried to exorcise the crime by fictionalizing it as a mystery novel called Quiet Time. But instead of laying the murder to rest, Quiet Time brought it roaring back to life. Cold Case Story is about a family that fractured along the fault lines of a murder. It's about fiction colliding with cold, hard crime and the very personal story of how it feels to ping-pong between participant and observer, novelist and witness to one's own uneasy set of facts. In the end, all are punished, even the guilty. This book was put out in March of 2021, and it was published by Cold Hard Press. I would like to welcome Stephanie Kane to the program. She has a fascinating book out called Cold Case Story. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you for having me.
This book is very short, but it's very packed with some really good story. Can you give a brief synopsis to our listeners about what it's about?
Sure. Cold Case Story is the true story of the murder of a Denver area housewife named Betty Fry in 1973. It's also the story of how that murder forced me to come to terms with my own role in it. What made it so personal is that Betty was murdered basically on the eve of my wedding to her son. In 1973, on the day of the murder, I was one of the last people to speak to her because she called the apartment where we were living. And I was also one of the first people to see her killer a couple of hours later, her husband, Dwayne, who came to the karate studio where my fiance was teaching that morning. And Dwayne was arrested back in 1973, but the charges were dropped. So that's the day of the murder. It didn't end there, of course. In 2001, about 30 years later, I wrote a highly fictionalized version of Betty's murder. And I did that to exorcise my own ghosts because I had this terrible, lingering sense of guilt and fear that the wedding was the catalyst. It was a very brutal murder. She was basically bludgeoned to death in her garage, and she had been very opposed to the wedding. Our marriage was over after about 10 years, and I went on and became a lawyer, and I remarried. But I never got over this terrible feeling that the wedding was a catalyst. So I published Quiet Time in 2001. Bantam published it. And it had a very short life and a quick death because it came out the week of 9/11. And so, of course, there was other things on people's minds than my book. So, the book was just on the shelves for a very short period of time. But then in 2005, a strange thing happened. Dwayne's sister happened to see an old rerun of an interview of me on public TV from 2001 when I'd been interviewed about Quiet Time. And she recognized me, and she went out and bought the book, and she read it. And as a result of that, she had sort of a crisis of conscience, and she came forward with a confession that Dwayne had made. So suddenly, a cold case was opened, and I was a prosecution witness. What Cold Case Story is, the true story, not the fictionalized Quiet Time version, but the true story of what happened the day Betty was killed, why the case against her killer fell apart in 1973, and what happened when it was reopened 30 years later. Just to finish this really quickly, Cold Case Story is going to be reissued in print as an ebook and an audiobook in November 2022 by a publisher that was going to rename it True Crime Redux. That's the story of Cold Case Story.
Very interesting. You didn't care for Betty that much, did you?
I wanted her to accept me. We came from two very different worlds. I was a Jewish girl from New York, and she was a very strict Catholic from Kansas. There were really big cultural differences, and she was not crazy about me marrying her son. It wasn't a question of me not liking her. What I really wanted was for her to accept me. Of course, that never happened.
As far as Dwayne, I would think they would look at him first thing. Why do you think it took so long for him to be charged?
Well, they did charge him. They charged him that summer. Betty was murdered in June, and I think by July, he was indicted by a grand jury for first-degree murder. He hired very good lawyers. He was supposed to come to trial that November. We got married later that summer. Obviously, we put the wedding off. Right before, I think it was the week of Thanksgiving, and he was going to be tried the next Monday or something like that, the charges against him were dropped. I never knew why that happened. Everybody just wanted to move on, and it was kind of taboo to talk about it. So for the almost 10 years that I was married to their son, we never talked about it. Everybody just wanted to put it away and move on. He was re-indicted as a result of the cold case in 2005. Certainly the last thing I ever expected or wanted to happen, but that's what happened.
Did your husband think Dwayne was guilty?
His son, you mean?
Yeah.
My first husband? Yeah. Boulder is about 30 or 40 miles from where Doug's parents lived. We were living in Boulder. We were students at CU in Boulder. The day of the murder, Dwayne just showed up that Saturday morning at the karate studio where Doug was teaching. I immediately noticed that there was something wrong. He had a big bruise on his forehead. It was a sweltering hot day, early June. He was wearing long-sleeve dark shirt, and he was behaving very peculiarly. We both noticed it. In retrospect, what he was doing was trying to use this trip to Boulder as his alibi.
Right.
And in fact, that's what he did do. He used it as an alibi.
I went to see my son. I couldn't have done it.
Yeah. But I remember Doug saying to me, right after his father left, he said, I wonder what's wrong. I've never seen him act that way. Huh. And then a couple of hours later, we got a phone call that his mother was dead.
Wow.
But the children all lined up behind their father. And one thing that I always didn't understand and wanted to understand, and I don't have a good answer for it, how kids can line up behind a father who kills their mother, and whether with the passage of time and when they're confronted with proof, as they were in the cold case, whether their attitudes change. In fact, their attitudes didn't change. And what I concluded is it depends not on what actually happened, but on each kid's personal identification with each of their parents, and also on the control that the killer continues to exert afterwards. That's my best guess of why they lined up behind him and why they continue to. 30 years later, even when confronted with his confession and all kinds of proof.
That's strange. Blood's thicker than water. The stigma of having a murderer in your family.
I think that's a very good point. Not just the public reaction to it, but your own sense of identity. You know, what does it mean if you have to accept that your father killed your mother? I mean, what does that say about who you are and what you thought your family was and all of that stuff? I don't think it's easy. I don't fault them for it.
Well, you can't. That's their life. Now, you write legal thrillers when you're not writing true crime.
Well, I've written 2 other series of mysteries. The first was a series of legal thrillers starring a dyslexic criminal defense lawyer named Jackie Flowers, who is a better lawyer because of her difficulties reading. And what that series was inspired by was a young relative of mine who had serious problems reading and was battered by the educational system, but ended up being a highly successful engineer. And that was kind of my inspiration for that character. And because I'd been a lawyer, I just thought, you know, what if I created a character who had none of the things that were my strong suit, my reading and that kind of, I guess, left brain kind of stuff? What if she was a better lawyer because she didn't have that? That was the inspiration for that series. And then I'm just about to come out in October with the 3rd book in a series starring a conservator of paintings named Lily Sparks. And Lily has a perfect eye, meaning she was sort of indoctrinated from the time she was a small child into having this sort of hyper focus. She's hyper observant. She picks up on details and patterns. And the inspiration for that character was also a real person, an art historian named Amy Herman, who trains doctors and lawyers and FBI agents and cops into being more observant by examining paintings in museums. So that was my inspiration for my second mystery series.
Wow, that sounds interesting. I was just watching a program on art forgery. Interesting field.
Yes, it is.
I don't know how they spot some of these.
You have to have a perfect eye.
I guess you do. You ran a karate studio for a while and you did legal defense work. Do you still work in those genres?
Nope. I left karate when I went to law school, and I left law when I started writing mysteries.
So you're writing full time?
Pretty much. I'm married to a judge, so law gives us something in common. He can talk about his cases. I can talk about my fictional characters.
Right. Are you writing anything now?
As I say, I'm just coming out on October 15th with the 3rd in my Paintings Conservator series, and it's called Object Lessons. And the inspiration is this wonderful character. I always get inspiration, obviously, from real people. And this was an eccentric heiress from Chicago named Frances Glessner Lee.
Oh, love her.
Do you know her? Don't you love her?
We were very lucky to meet the conservator of the little dioramas
Oh, really?
at the University of Maryland. And we have been very lucky enough to go visit them and see the displays.
Did you see them at the Renwick Gallery in Washington, D.C.?
My daughter and my other partner, they went down. I wasn't able to go, but we did see them at their home in the medical examiner's office in Baltimore.
Oh, you were so lucky to be there.
Oh, yes. Bruce Goldfarb is the conservator. He wrote a book about her, which is very fascinating.
She's one of my heroes. I think she was just fantastic. So she inspired the book that's coming out, and in it, a Washington, D.C. forensic team brings its own set of crime scene dioramas to Denver to train local cops. And then, of course, this baffling series of life-sized murders soon follows.
Ooh.
So is the killer using the dioramas as roadmaps, or maybe targeting victims based on what their houses say about them? So I just had terrific fun writing that.
Would you please send us a copy of that book?
Oh,
We can
I would
review it.
love to.
She's one of our heroes.